In my life with Arabian horses, I've had the pleasure of meeting some amazing, amazing Arabians and also some extremely interesting people, including my three friends that joined me this morning, Cynthia Culbertson, Kale from Carho International, and Mindy Peters from El Capitan Ranch. Thank you for joining me and talking about Arabian horses. Cynthia, give us a little bit of background on you and your introduction to Arabian horses.
Well, you know, like so many young girls, I was born loving horses, but I probably was about 7 years old when I saw my first photograph of an Arabian, and literally that was the moment. I was in love. So from that point on, it became a passion, obsession. I showed, trained, and rode. And then it was interesting because I always wanted to learn more about these Arabian horses. And I thought, you know, here I am reading about Arabian horses in English from all these Europeans and so on. Why am I not reading about Arabian horses from the Arabs? So actually, when I went to school, I got a degree in Arabic and Islamic studies. So people always say, why did you study Arabic? And actually, it was that passion for the horse that led me to study Arabic.
Do you remember which horse it was that you saw the photo of?
I actually do. Believe it or not, it was in Western Horsemen.
Wow.
When the farms like Glenlock Farms actually in the 60s used to advertise their horses.
Wow.
And then of course there was a magazine called Arabian Horse News and then Arabian Horse World. And in those days I was from a teeny town in Indiana. Our little local pharmacy carried magazines, and would you believe they carried the Arabian Horse magazines?
Wow.
So that was the biggest moment of my life, was when the magazine came.
Right. That's awesome.
It is. And Jenny, obviously we talked the other day.
Yes.
You are a third generation.
I am a third generation.
High five.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, my grandfather started with Arabians in 1939. And my grandfather and father and the LaCroix were the first ones, Arabians imported directly from Poland to the United States. Shirley Watts obviously has already gone before. She was in England, but to go directly and import, they were the first ones. And my dad imported a horse named Dornava, who was the first mare to win the Triple Crown.
Gorgeous.
And yes, and LaCroix, of course, imported the Immortal Bosque, who needs no introduction. And then in the 1980s, my father got very interested in the horses in Russia. And he was actually overdoing some financial things for his real world job and ended up seeing some of the horses that imported to England from Russia. Got very excited about that, decided he was going to go to Poland because he heard there were some relationships there, saw them, and then decided he was going to go directly to Russia. Well, in the 1970s, you weren't allowed to go to Russia if you were an American. So he had to actually get his visa through the bank he was working with in England in order to go over there.
Talk about passion.
Right, exactly. And you know, you hear this story that he tells. He said, you know, called my parents, got my visa, you know, the day before I was supposed to leave at 10 o'clock in the morning. So excited, and marked lack of enthusiasm from his parents. You know, okay, take good care of yourself. And he's like, I am, but I'm going to see those horses. Take good care of yourself, you know, make good choices. Didn't notify, and he said, you know, got on the airplane real excited, and he said then about the third hour, all of these James Bond films start to play, and he's going, hey, dummy, this plane is going to land in Russia. You didn't notify the State Department. Nobody in the government knows where you're at. You know, he's like, what am I doing? This makes no sense. What, you're not very smart. You know, what do you do? And starts praying. So he lands, and he's decided whenever he lands in Russia, the first thing he's going to do is get on a plane anywhere. He doesn't care where it's going. He's not going to get out of the airport. He's going to stop, replan, do this again. So he gets off. Well, the plane lands, and soldiers with machine guns line up, and there are bars on the wall, and it's actually a jail that they're going into.
You're kidding.
There's bars on the wall. You can't see anything through the windows. So they line up, and the machine guns are in front of them, and they literally push everybody out. And my dad says, you know, I was going to get in the middle of the pack so nobody could see me. Well, that's a really good plan, except for the average Russian is 5'11", and my dad is 6'4". You know, it's not like you're going to blend in, buddy. So anyway, I grew up with stories of these, and getting back to my thing with the Arabian horse, my passion, my first word was horsey. Like there was no, there was no mama, there was no daddy, it was horsey. So, and I've just recently, Dad's decided to step back into an advisory role, meaning, of course, that he is advising on everything. So, and he's a blast. He's a really, really great guy. My grandpa was the same thing. So, I'm starting to take it over. We're developing the relationship back with Tursk again after all their turmoils. And,
Wonderful.
Yeah, and it's nice. So we've got a couple of straight Russians, as the story goes, but mostly Russian related, and just sort of a lot of different, you know, Boss through Tornado and things like that. So that's kind of my
Great story.
Yeah. Thank you.
And Mindy, you an Iowa girl.
An Iowa girl, Midwest girl. third generation horse breeder. My grandfather was the first, bought his first Arabian from Dan Gainey Sr. in 1957 when they were in Minnesota before they moved to California. And after my grandfather passed away, my aunt took over the breeding program, and now me.
It's awesome.
So, and I'm hoping my daughter will be the fourth generation.
Let's hope.
Yeah.
Now, Jenny, you said something interesting just a minute ago when you said his real job.
Yes.
It's funny how many people in our industry have what we call real jobs, and actually the four of us, Arabians for us, are a full-time job.
Right.
And Cynthia, tell us a little bit about what you do, because I mean I met you back in the 90s, I think it was.
I think you're right.
At Club Metz when Silver Maple Farm was in Naples.
Down in Naples,
and
Florida.
Henry and Christy Metz with their weekend party and presentation and horse seminar. Cynthia, in the evening, Henry and Christy had put up an amazing tent. Well, they always throw a great party, but it was a dinner that was to be served, and Cynthia, you were doing storytelling.
I was.
And
I was the Scheherazade of the evening.
There you go.
Love it.
Well done.
I think I went to bed, though, that night listening to Cynthia's voice and the story, and it really just is amazing, the history. And, well, first of all, as you already know, you're a very eloquent speaker, but yeah, share with us a little bit about your career with Arabian horses.
I actually had a real job for many years as a management analyst, but I think it's always wonderful when you can combine a passion and a love with a way to make a living. And so for me, I probably was more focused with my education on the history, and David mentioned stories. And I think that it's so important. The Arabian breed has more stories than any kind of horse in the world. It's amazing because that 3,500-year history. And I always say the cast of characters is beyond compare. Yeah. You have King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Right. You have Napoleon, who invades a country and then loves the horses so much that he dresses his own horse in the fashion of the enemies. And you have the aristocracy of Europe. You have even George Washington, who admired the Arabian horse. So there's all these wonderful, wonderful stories. And I think when you talk about that history, you always think if that captures the imagination of one person, and they realize that when you're out there with that horse, literally, it's an example of living history. I mean, something so precious that it was kept in a pure form for that time. Thousands of years. I mean, that's really a classic. So I think that's really an important part of our breed, is we have that marvelous history, those really great stories.
And I thought what was really interesting, I read an article that Cynthia wrote about the movie Hidalgo. And it was so interesting. I mean, talk about from that. She just got so riled up. And I mean, obviously, based on a true story in Hollywood means it might have, a grain of fact that one name is the same. But it's just was so funny. And I could, in meeting you now, because I'd never met Cynthia before this, I can see where she's just like, you have so many absolutely phenomenal real stories about Arabians, about this, that, and the other thing. Why would you need to make something up?
Yeah.
So it's nice to see your passion and sort of where you're coming from. And there's so many great histories, so many, like you said, cast of characters, that it's nice for people to hear about that, and for you to be able, you're talking about how they're coffee table books, but those are really the best books to read because you can actually learn something about something.
I think that's true. I always
fun.
joke, I've done a couple of books with Italian photographer Gigi Grasso, and I always joke that, with beautiful photography, nobody reads what you write, But it's still fun to tell the stories of the horses. And one thing I really love is talking to the people and listening to their stories and how they feel about the horses.
Exactly.
And I
think
everybody
who has an Arabian horse has a story.
Exactly. Yes.
And they speak to us.
Right.
I mean, and we're not alone. That nobility, the way they relate to us. We have those stories because the horse gives us those stories.
Exactly.
They're very personable, love people, extremely intelligent.
Exactly.
And speaking of Hollywood, I want you guys' opinion. That's my real job, is making films. What Arabian horse story do you think would be best made into a film at this point? I'm going to mention one that we have the opportunity to buy the rights to. It's King of the Wind. And it's maybe more of a children's story, but a great story. So I'd like some suggestions.
I love that one. I think that's really great because it has the classic love of a young child for a horse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it also has more countries. You go from Morocco to France to the UK.
Yes.
And you can tie it in because that particular horse, people may not know the story, but he became one of the foundation sires of the thoroughbred breed.
Right.
Yes.
So I think that's a terrific story and a terrific choice. I think it has all of the elements, really. I do.
Right.
Yeah.
And there are others, there were all these adventurers. And, we think about, we fly to a different country and we go to a horse show, maybe we think that's an adventure.
Right.
But when Arabians became so popular for improving the horses of Europe, so many people traveled to the Middle East, to the desert. I mean, you think of the courage that took. And there was a great Polish count, Count Przewózki, who had an incredible manuscript.
Yeah.
And his adventures in the desert, I mean, that one too is very rich in romance and adventure.
I need to
and
talk
brought
to you
all of
about
these
that one
horses back.
afterwards.
And that's a really good one. The Horsefly Films girls, whenever they did the Path to Glory movie,
Yes,
they
I
did
saw
quite
that.
a bit, research on him, so they'd be a good resource as well.
And that's
Right.
actually the manuscripts are going to be published in the future.
Oh, that's
so that
so great.
project is ongoing. So we'll all get to read about his
That's
adventures.
wonderful.
It's a great story too.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
I have a little bit of a bias, of course, being from my family. My dad's in the process of writing the Muscat story, and the story of going to Russia and things like that. It's been something that everybody's been asking for.
Yeah, I'm sure.
6,000 years it seems like, and to sit down and talk about sort of an American and overcoming the cultural odds and really developing relationships.
That would be a great story
now.
as well.
And I don't know. I mean, obviously, I sit here and I'm like, go daddy, because I grew up, everybody else, all the other girls got Cinderella and things like that, and I got these stories of horses racing across the meadows in Russia, coats of liquid fire, big black eyes, so I always had this romantic, the stories he knew and the stories he told me, because Dad building caro 16 hours a day whenever I was little. And he'd get up and he'd tie my shoes for school in the morning. That was always his thing. And he'd tie them so tight my feet would hurt. Tighter, Daddy, tighter. And it just, big old being my dad. And then at night he'd come home and he'd tuck me in. And rather than, reading stories, because, he had absolutely no interest in little girl stories, he would tell me a story of, Grandpa riding the horse over to LaCroix for 6 miles to get her bred, taking the tack off, breeding the horse, bring her back, Or he'd, tell me stories of, what it took to drink a Russian under the table as as a 7-year-old. And it just, these stories of the horses, and some of them were happy and some of them were sad. And
Right.
But a lot of fairy tales I didn't read till I went to school. I heard horse stories. That's what I grew up with.
Fantastic.
Well, and I think for myself, I've been involved in the Arabian horse industry for about 16 years. And the last days sitting here with people who have been in the industry 30 and 40 years, and then having you two, third generation, for me, it really is exciting to hear the stories and the history of the horses, as well as hearing everyday people's stories, about their horse and a special foal, and even Daryl Larson talking about her days at Rohara and breeding 100 mares on the farm and having, I'm complaining because I have 15 foals born.
That's so cool.
And in the day they had 100 foals.
Yep.
And
There really are great stories, though. I was at lunch
amazing stories.
yesterday with a guy who I had never met before. This was the first time we had met, and he started telling about his favorite brood mare, and she was born on his farm, and then she was an orphan. So she ended up being raised in his kitchen, and he had all these great stories, and her name ended up being Hey Baby. She's a straight Egyptian, which, typically the straight Egyptians have desert names. And this
Hey
mare's
Baby,
name is
that's
Hey
funny.
Baby.
It's cute.
Yep.
So, anyway, it's just the Arabian horse is a great connection between human beings too, all around the world.
I agree.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely transcends cultures, political
Yes.
differences. That love for the horse will just cut through all of that. And your Russia stories are that as well.
Yes.
You know,
And it's-
completely different ideology at that
Exactly.
time, political differences.
Yeah, and it's interesting going back this year. I've done a fair amount of traveling, studied overseas, but I've never been anywhere where you feel completely foreign. You can't read the signs.
Right.
You are completely helpless in Russia.
Yeah.
And you go in the barns, and it's so cool because you have these people that are and the Russians are start off very candid. And it was really interesting because we walked in and the man that was driving us, he said, my grandfather worked for Terse and my father just died at Terse last year.
Wow.
I mean, they've been there for generations. And some of the other ones that didn't, speak in English, you'd go in and you'd be looking at horses and you just point and thumbs up, thumbs down, kind of this like this, whatever. But look at this, and I'm talking in English and they're talking in Russian, and we're having this conversation, and it's an amazing. And you talked about having 100 foals. Whenever I was a kid, we had 400 broodmares.
Oh my goodness!
Whenever I was little.
Wow. And how many babies did you guys typically have in a year?
Oh, anywhere from. In the height of the 80s, which was a little bit before me, but height of the 80s, they probably had anywhere between 200 and 250 horses.
Wow.
Because, see, Dad had all the horses at Kazakhstan at that time in Holland.
Right.
So he had the horses that he had in Holland that he was breeding that couldn't come in because of pyroplasmosis.
Right.
That he was breeding there, and then he also had quite a few horses in Brazil. He was showing horses, on four continents.
So you guys would literally have 200 foals
we would start a poker game. It was always funny as a little kid. The poker game would start in January, and you just sort of rotate in and rotate out if you were up on mare watch. And it was sort of one of those things that, and there were a couple TVs in the barns, but it was really, everybody was up, and that was my favorite time because, also my mom and my grandma especially was a phenomenal cook. You'd just start a pot of soup. And you'd start one big pot, and you just keep, chili or whatever it was. And it was fun, sometimes the guys would start music, somebody'd break out a guitar, and as a little kid, you don't understand what's happening. You don't understand everybody's tired, and they're worried, and they're this. I mean, it's just a fun time.
That's fun.
And, David, you made an interesting point saying, I've been in this industry for 16 years, and I think a lot of people, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge that, because I think a lot of people don't realize that you are Stonewall Farms, and that you do breed, and that you do export a lot, and you've got a couple of mares here that are showing that you've bred. And I think a lot of people see you as doing what you do so well, coming and networking, doing things with the internet and equine and this, that, and the other thing, and Scott as well, but they don't realize that you do have a hands-on connection. So if you'll speak a little bit about
beautiful
yes, exactly, beautiful gray mares.
Thank you, ladies.
So
in
if you
fact,
speak a little bit about that.
You had a filly that won here this week.
I did.
Yes.
And I saw her as a baby on your farm right after she was born and thought she was absolutely stunning. And when I saw her this week, I thought she had turned into even a better filly than she was when she was born.
I agree.
That's wonderful.
She's a beautiful filly. We're very proud.
Yes.
And, we've talked a lot about stallions and all of that. I'd like each one of you, or let's take some time to just talk about a special mare or a mare that touched, our lives. Cynthia, I'll let you begin.
Oh, there have been so many. I think I was really fortunate to, as you were as well, to travel when I was young and go to my parents, of course, this horse crazy girl. Everywhere we traveled in the United States, I knew where there was an Arabian horse farm. And I also have to acknowledge during the 60s and the 70s how kind so many farms were, whether it was Daisy Tankersley or the Gainies and so on, to a horse crazy girl. And I wasn't demanding it. Nowadays we take out so many horses. It was just a privilege to stop and visit with these people.
Absolutely.
So I always tell farms, don't forget that.
Right.
When people want to come by, because you never know. Many years later, they come back as your client. So it's very hard for me to pick a mare. There have been so many. I think some pivotal moments for me are horses that are completely different. Mm-hmm. And I also grew up in the Midwest, and I think, Mindy, you would agree that we had many famous historic breeders in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indiana, Iowa. We were very fortunate, and there was a lot of Arabian horse history right there in the Midwest. But I remember, this is probably 70s, being in a show maybe in Illinois, and a mare came in the ring, and she was so different from anything I have ever seen. I was just dumbstruck. And the mare was Bint Mais El Sagira from Egypt. And of course she went on to be the dam of Sheikh Abadi, many other horses, and then Rumanaj Ali. So we see that not just in Egyptian pedigrees, we see that mare in pedigrees, I think, throughout the Arabian horse world. But she was this bay, she was so leggy, and by today's standards, of course, she wouldn't have had an exotic head. But she was so different, so elegant. It was just one of those moments. So I always remember her, and she's actually one of many from all bloodlines. I remember the first time I went to Europe, seeing the mare from Mihal, the E line. Oh my goodness, I couldn't breathe. And horses, so many. I have a Russian mare story too. I wanted to ask you, what's the word for woe in Russian? Do you have any idea what they say?
Well, they'll say stop.
Stop.
It's stop.
Okay.
But yes.
Most people don't know this, but in the early days, you can have stories from this, of importation, the registry had to come out and inspect each horse imported before it could be put into the Arabian horse registry.
Right.
So I took a year off from college. Every parent loves this.
Yeah.
To go out at Ansada Arabian Stud, well-known, very well-known breeding farm, Judy Forbes. That was a great privilege for me. And at the time, of course, their stallion Ansada bin Halima was very famous.
Yes.
And a mare came in from Russia, Panama,
Yes.
of Terce.
Panama Terce.
And big, wonderful mare, great big eyes, and just really terrific mare. And looked so kind and so wonderful. And, she comes off, and, I take her off the trail. I'll never forget. And we came to something, and I said, "Whoa!" And she just flattened me. And I thought, and she would never do that. She was a wonderful mare. She had a great disposition. And I thought, she had no idea what I was saying.
Maybe woman, go.
I should have said, "Stop, stop."
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's funny, bringing up, as you were just saying, the horses with, sort of the classic Egyptian, but Panama of Terce is actually the great-great-granddam of the reserve world champion filly this year.
She is indeed.
And so I just sit there and it's just like, and Panama was, as you're saying, phenomenal big mover.
Oh.
And she was not pretty. Like, she was an Arax mare. But she was, and it's nice to be able to see some of these old mares that, what they can produce coming through and all the great parts of them.
Absolutely.
And like you were saying that, by today's standards, we've improved type exponentially. And, in my family, we have that discussion. My dad says, my definition of perfection from 20 years ago has been surpassed, but I've updated my definition. I haven't hit my current definition.
Sure.
But it's nice to be able to see the parts that come through from the past coming forward. And I think that's something that we're all lucky being involved for as long as we have. But the newcomers that come in that hear some of these stories that haven't been involved before, that if you sit down and you talk to somebody that's been involved, it's amazing to hear those stories, and everybody kind of knows the great old horses.
I agree.
Yeah,
and what about you,
very
Mindy?
true.
Yeah, who's your person, Mindy?
I would say, well, my favorite mare is Belsong, HVP. I imported her from Brazil, and she's a Magnum Psyche daughter out of a Padrone daughter.
I know her
So
well.
there's some,
Beautiful mare.
She is a beautiful mare, and I think the thing that, she's drop dead gorgeous. She's been Brazilian national champion, Scottsdale champion, but the thing that has bonded me to her most is her personality, which is all Arabians. They just have unique personalities, but for everything that she's been through, all the travel, all the stress of showing, being bred, having foals, this mare she's still so above it all, and so elegant, and so graceful and gracious, and anyone can come in her stall, and she doesn't go to the back of her stall and give you her booty. She's, comes right up and wants a carrot and wants to talk to you and get to know you, and I love that mare. Absolutely. I love her, and I just had a filly this year.
Good job.
First filly from Belsong. She looks just like
and how
her
many
mama.
colts?
Awesome.
Southern Belle is her name.
Oh, that's
wonderful.
I love
Very
Southern
nice.
Belle.
Very cool. David, who's yours?
Well, I know that everyone knows the answer to that, and that's BB Flamingo Rose.
Of course.
For me, one of the very first mares that I purchased, and of course the mare that went on to capture my heart and reaffirm to me, or just not reaffirm, but give me the ideal, in my mind, what I thought was the ideal Arabian horse.
Yes.
From her structure, her conformation, her attitude, and just her personality as well.
Yeah.
She truly, I think if BB would have been a human, she would have been Elizabeth Taylor.
Yeah.
Oh, I think so too.
I mean,
and when I see you two together, a photo, it is pure love.
Yes.
I mean, it is amazing.
It really is amazing, the bond that I did have with her, and it's a funny story that many people have heard, but I'll tell it again. When I lived in Michigan, how I acquired her is I had told the trainer at the time that we were using, if he ever found a mare that could put me on the map as a breeder, start my program and bring some instant recognition to my program to let me know. And about 3 months later, he calls me and says, "You need to come up to my farm. I've got a mare for you." I jump in my car, drive an hour and a half one way, and he hands me a pedigree. And of course, I didn't know pedigrees. I'm just looking, BB Flamingo Rose, Boss Flame, and from what he told me, old Donahue breeding, Elmara on the dam side. And I said, okay, where is she? Oh, well, she's not here. Do you have a video? No. Photos? No. And she was $25,000, which was a lot of money.
Right.
And he says, not only that, you have to let me know within 24 hours.
Oh, wow.
So I get in the car and I called Scott and said, I don't know what to do, and he tells me this is an amazing mare, and I'm not a real religious person, but I'm one of those that, God, give me a sign. And I just said, please give me a sign on what I should do with this mare. And I'm driving down the road and I stop at a red light and I look over and I'm like, there's my sign. It's the front yard of a house that must have had 2 or 3 dozen plastic pink flamingos
No way.
in the lawn with a big flamingo that said on a sign, it's a girl. And she was in foal. And so I called him and said,
that's awesome.
She's mine.
That's a great story.
And although it may not mean anything, to me it means a lot. And
absolutely.
And of course, BB went on to again to establish my breeding program, and again, not just the things that she contributed as a broodmare, it was the things that she contributed to me in my life as a human-animal connection.
Right. Yes.
And you had said, Mindy, how the horses are, very friendly and this and that. I think what I find about Arabians is they are very much like humans.
They really
to where I have one that I can say, this colt reminds me of so-and-so in his personality.
So true.
And this filly is, more like this one. And it is really funny how they all have extremely unique personalities. I have a mare that just joined us. I'm sure you all know, Vanna Sharina, who is the mother of W.H. Justice. And it's funny, getting to know Vanna. Vanna's been with us now for a month. And I approach the stall, and my stall fronts are the European style, where I can reach over and pet them. And she will come to the front of the stall, and she'll reach her head out, and I'll go to pet her, and she'll pull back. And I realized, after a week or so of doing this, she's doing this because she wants me to come into the stall.
She wants you to come closer.
She does not want me to pet her over the rail, but to come into the stall.
Then you can get away easier. If she gets you in there, you'll stay.
Yeah,
well, and of course, she always knows I has carrots.
Yeah,
so, But
I have to say, one fun memory I remember as a kid is we sold. I was probably 10. We ended up selling a group of mares to a stud farm in Texas. And they were out sort of in the Weatherford area, and they were going to breed some Arabs, half-Arab crosses and things like that. And we go out in the field, and it's a 50-acre field, and the horses are way over the hill.
Wow.
And they've got, of course, big ponds,
ATVs.
tanks, as they call it. And so we walk out, and the person's just like, the woman's worried. Oh, well, I really wanted you to see them and check on them. How are they doing? She's holding her hands and, worrying. And Dad's like, oh, that's all right. I'll get him. And he goes, come here. And a big bellow. Girls, come here. There's nothing. It's just dead silence. And the lady's like looking at my dad now. She's like, okay, crazy, man. And then all of a sudden you feel the ground start to do this.
Wow.
Right? And this group of 60 mares come in a dead run up over the hill and down, coming up like that. And they came up to him. And, one of them had been, one of my dad's real close favorite mares, and comes up to him, and they're paying, and she's calling, and and they came right up, and I thought that was really cool. I was like, wow, because Dad walked the pastures every day and was always out with them and wrangling something, and and I just thought that was one of those where, and Cynthia can, I'm sure, talk more about whenever the Bedouins would bring them into their tents at night for warmth, and use the stallions as guard dogs, essentially, leaving them out, and the whole history is one of people orientation.
Yep, absolutely.
And relationship with people, and it meant life or death for these people. These mares did.
Right.
If you had a mare that was flighty, or you had a mare that didn't have a connection with you or didn't like you, you weren't coming back.
Right.
I think that's a really important point, and I always remind people. They will ask historically what were the most important. What did the Bedou choose from? What does the literature tell us? And first, always is purity.
Right.
But second to that, it's character.
Yes.
And loyalty.
And I think we should all, as breeders, be cognizant of that. Because that relationship became a genetic element of the breed.
Absolutely.
And remember that so many other breeds, the horse itself evolved on the plains or big pastures, and those didn't exist in the desert. When it rained, you traveled to get that.
Right.
But those horses were never loose in big pastures. They were staked, they were near the tent, they were around the family. So they socialized much more like a relationship. We would think a pet, a dog. And they actually imprinted foals. The Bedouin imprinted foals. We definitely know this long before, hundreds, centuries before that was scientifically validated. So they understood that those horses literally felt like the people were a part of their own herd.
Absolutely.
So with that relationship, you get a horse that would actually defend you in battle. That was the primary purpose. But that characteristic is with us because you would select, like you say, against a flighty horse or a horse that didn't do that. And a good story I have about that is I was very privileged to work with Dr. Sandra Olson on International Museum exhibition. She's head of anthropology at Carnegie Museum of Natural History. And she's a great zooarchaeologist specializing in horse domestication. So she did most of her work in Kazakhstan, and they still have their herds of horses, very much we think of the Asian steppe and Mongolian horses and so on. And so she's been with them, so many times, and those horses go out and so on, and we happened to be in Egypt seeking loans for the exhibition. And we went to the EAO, and here all of these years studying horse domestication, I said, do you want to go? They have big sand paddocks, the eucalyptus trees and so on. We went in the paddock, and it was feeding time. They have big open barns, actually very similar to Poland. And the doors open, and it's feeding time, and the grooms are there. And she said, well, no, obviously they're going. I said, no, come in. And she said, what are you talking about? So we went in, and of course, everybody turns and says, people. And all of those mares and foals came back out and surrounded us.
Of course.
And she was just dumbstruck. She was like, she'd heard all this stuff. It was the first time to her. She realized that bond exists even today, to the point that those horses would rather come see us as people in the paddock than go in the barn.
Exactly.
Well, ladies, I am so sorry we don't have more time, but thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome.
And I look forward to another story time.
Yes.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, David.